In the year 476, the last Roman emperor in the West was quietly removed from power, and nobody at the time thought it was the end of anything. There was no dramatic final battle, no last stand. Just a teenage emperor handed over, and a continent that had been held together for centuries by Roman law, Roman roads, and Roman order suddenly left to figure out what came next. What came next is 1,000 years that most people in the United States only know through fragments. Knights, castles, plague, crusades, a vague sense of mud, misery, and men in armor. But the real story of medieval Europe is bigger, stranger, and far more consequential than the fragments suggest. This is the era that produced the university, the modern nation-state, the foundations of English common law, and, through catastrophe after catastrophe, some of the most resilient societies in human history. This is the entire story, start to finish, of the 1,000 years between Rome's fall and the world we recognize as modern beginning to take shape. If deep historical breakdowns like this are what you come here for, go ahead and subscribe and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It genuinely helps this channel grow. Let's start where it begins, with an empire that didn't so much fall as fracture. For a long time, the period right after Rome's collapse in the West was called the Dark Ages, a name that implied ignorance, backwardness, a civilization that had simply stopped. Modern historians have largely abandoned that framing, and for good reason. It wasn't darkness. It was disruption, the sudden absence of a single unifying political and economic system that had connected Britain to Egypt for nearly 500 years, replaced by a patchwork of smaller, competing kingdoms trying to figure out how to govern without Rome's infrastructure behind them. Western Europe in the 6th century was fragmented into successor kingdoms built largely by the same Germanic peoples who had crossed into Roman territory in the century before. The Ostrogoths in Italy, the Visigoths in Spain, the Vandals in North Africa, and, most consequentially for the future of the continent, the Franks in what is now France and Western Germany. These weren't simple, illiterate tribal bands, as older stereotypes suggested. Many Germanic kingdoms actively preserved elements of Roman law and administration, because Roman systems, whatever their flaws, still worked better than starting from nothing. Trade networks that had once stretched across the entire Mediterranean shrank dramatically. Cities that had housed tens of thousands of people under Roman administration lost much of their population as urban infrastructure. Aqueducts, sewers, organized food supply chains stopped being maintained at Roman scale. Literacy, once relatively widespread among Roman administrators and elites, became increasingly concentrated in one institution that would come to dominate medieval life more than almost any other: the Christian Church. Monasteries, in particular, became the unlikely engines that kept large parts of classical knowledge alive through this uncertain period. Monks copied manuscripts by hand, preserved texts from ancient Greek and Roman writers, and maintained some of the only formal education available across much of Western Europe. Without this specific institutional habit, monks in scattered monasteries painstakingly recopying texts generation after generation, a substantial portion of ancient literature that survives today simply wouldn't exist. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Mediterranean, the story was strikingly different. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered on Constantinople and known to modern historians as the Byzantine Empire, didn't experience anything like the same collapse. It remained a wealthy, literate, highly organized state for centuries after Rome's fall in the West, and under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, briefly reconquered large parts of Italy and North Africa in an attempt to restore Roman unity. That reconquest didn't hold permanently, but it's a critical reminder that Rome falling was, in real terms, a Western story. The Roman world, broadly defined, continued. By the late 6th and 7th centuries, a new and completely unexpected force was reshaping the wider Mediterranean world. The rapid rise and expansion of Islam following the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632. Within roughly a century, Arab-led Islamic forces had conquered territory stretching from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the borders of India in the east, fundamentally reshaping trade routes, cutting off parts of the old Roman Mediterranean economy from Western Europe, and creating one of the most sophisticated, scientifically advanced civilizations of the medieval world, one that would later play a crucial role in preserving and expanding classical Greek philosophy and science that Western Europe had largely lost access to. This is the world medieval Europe actually began in, not a single dramatic collapse, but a fractured, reorganizing continent, surrounded by other powerful civilizations, slowly rebuilding its own institutions from what remained of Rome's foundations. Out of this fragmented world, one Frankish family would eventually attempt something extraordinary, rebuilding something resembling imperial unity in Western Europe for the first time since Rome's fall. The Frankish kingdom, under a dynasty called the Carolingians, had already been growing in power through the 8th century, particularly under a military leader named Charles Martel, who in 732 led Frankish forces to a decisive victory against an advancing Umayyad Islamic army at the Battle of Tours, a battle many historians consider one of the most consequential military engagements in Western European history, halting further large-scale Islamic expansion into Frankish territory from the south. Charles Martel's grandson, a man history would come to call Charlemagne, Charles the Great, inherited Frankish leadership in 768 and spent the following decades doing something no one in Western Europe had attempted at scale, in centuries, building an empire. Through a combination of relentless military campaigning, religious conversion often enforced by the sword, particularly against Saxon populations to the east, and shrewd political alliance building, Charlemagne expanded Frankish control across much of modern France, Germany, northern Italy, and parts of Spain. On Christmas Day in the year 800 in Rome, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as Holy Roman Emperor, a title that deliberately and directly invoked the memory of the Roman Empire that had fallen more than 3 centuries earlier. Whether Charlemagne himself was surprised by the exact moment of the coronation, as some later sources suggest, or had fully anticipated and orchestrated it, the symbolic message was unmistakable. A Frankish king was now claiming to be Rome's legitimate successor, with the Church's explicit blessing. Charlemagne's empire produced what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance, a genuine deliberate revival of learning, literacy, and classical scholarship, centered on his court and a network of monasteries and schools he actively promoted. He recruited scholars from across Europe, most famously an English monk named Alcuin of York, to standardize education, improve the quality of Latin manuscripts being copied, and establish a more consistent, legible form of handwriting called Carolingian minuscule, a script so much clearer than what preceded it that Renaissance scholars centuries later, encountering Carolingian manuscripts, mistook the handwriting for ancient Roman script and modeled early printed fonts directly on it. But Charlemagne's empire, like so many personally built medieval kingdoms, depended enormously on one exceptionally capable ruler holding it together. After his death in 814, his son Louis the Pious struggled to manage the same territory, and following Louis's own death, the empire was formally divided among his 3 grandsons under the Treaty of Verdun in 843, a division whose rough boundaries would echo, remarkably, in the eventual borders separating France and Germany for the next 1,000 years. The unified Carolingian moment had passed, but it left behind something important, proof that large-scale political and cultural revival was possible in post-Roman Europe, and administrative and educational foundations that later medieval kingdoms would continue building on. As the Carolingian Empire fractured through the 9th century, a new and terrifying threat emerged from an unexpected direction: the sea. Beginning with a devastating raid on the undefended monastery at Lindisfarne, off the coast of northeastern England, in 793, Scandinavian raiders, the people history remembers as Vikings, began a period of roughly 2.5 centuries of raiding, trading, and eventually settling across huge portions of Europe. Their advanced shipbuilding technology, particularly the longship, allowed them to strike coastal and river settlements with a speed and unpredictability that medieval European defenses were simply not built to handle. Viking activity wasn't purely destructive raiding, though the raids themselves were often brutal and specifically targeted wealthy, poorly defended monasteries, which is part of why monastic chroniclers, the people actually writing down what happened, described Vikings in such uniformly terrifying terms. Scandinavian traders and settlers also established major trade networks stretching from North America, where Norse settlers briefly established a colony in Newfoundland around the year 1000, all the way to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphate, trading furs, amber, and enslaved captives along river routes through Eastern Europe, where Norse traders known as the Rus gave their name to the eventual foundation of the medieval state of Kievan Rus, an ancestor of modern Russia and Ukraine. In England specifically, sustained Viking invasion eventually led to the establishment of Danelaw, a large territory under direct Scandinavian political and legal control, before English resistance under King Alfred the Great of Wessex in the late 9th century began the slow process of pushing back and eventually unifying England under a single English crown. In France, Viking raiders were eventually granted their own territory by treaty in 911, a region that took its name directly from its new Norse rulers, Normandy, land of the Northmen. The descendants of these Norse settlers, having adopted French language and Christianity within a few generations, would go on in 1066 to change the course of English history entirely when William, Duke of Normandy, invaded and conquered England at the Battle of Hastings. The constant instability of this period, Viking raids, Carolingian fragmentation, Weak central authority across much of Western Europe pushed medieval society toward a new organizing structure that historians traditionally call feudalism, though modern scholars increasingly debate how uniformly or formally this system actually operated across different regions and time periods. In broad terms, feudal relationships were built around exchanges of land for military service and loyalty. A king or major lord granted land, called a fief, to a vassal in exchange for military support, and that vassal might in turn grant portions of that land to lesser lords beneath him, creating layered chains of obligation that, at least in theory, connected the highest king down to the peasants actually working the land. Those peasants, the overwhelming majority of the medieval population, typically lived as serfs, tied to specific manors and obligated to work the lord's land in exchange for protection and the right to farm smaller plots for their own family's survival. Serfdom wasn't identical to slavery. Serfs generally couldn't be bought and sold as individuals separate from the land, but it was a deeply restrictive, hereditary status that bound the vast majority of medieval Europeans to lives of agricultural labor with extremely limited personal freedom or social mobility. Throughout all of this political fragmentation, one institution provided something approaching continuity and shared identity across the entire patchwork of medieval kingdoms: the Catholic Church. The Church in medieval Europe wasn't simply a religious institution in the modern sense. It was functionally one of the largest landowners in Europe, an enormous economic and political power in its own right, the primary provider of education and literacy, the keeper of most historical and legal records, and the source of ultimate moral authority that even kings had to publicly respect, even when they privately resented or resisted it. The papacy, the office of the Pope in Rome, spent much of the medieval period locked in ongoing tension with secular rulers over exactly how much political power the Church should hold. One of the most dramatic examples came during what's known as the investiture controversy in the late 11th century, when Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII clashed directly over who had the authority to appoint bishops, a seemingly narrow administrative question that was really about a much bigger issue: whether kings or popes held ultimate authority in Christian Europe. The conflict escalated to the point that Henry IV, having been excommunicated, reportedly stood barefoot in the snow outside Gregory's residence at Canossa in 1077 for 3 days, seeking forgiveness, a moment that became a lasting symbol of papal authority's real power over even the most powerful secular rulers in Europe. The Church's structure also split permanently during this period. In 1054, long-standing theological, political, and cultural tensions between the Latin-speaking Western Church, centered on Rome, and the Greek-speaking Eastern Church, centered on Constantinople, culminated in what's known as the Great Schism, a formal split between what became the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East, a division that, in significant ways, persists to this day. Monasteries continued to function as centers of education, healthcare, and agricultural innovation throughout this period. Monastic orders like the Benedictines, and later reform movements like the Cistercians, developed increasingly sophisticated farming techniques, including improved crop rotation systems, that gradually increased agricultural productivity across medieval Europe. This mattered enormously because more efficient farming meant more food surplus, which meant population growth, which meant eventually larger towns, more specialized trades, and the slow re-emergence of urban life that had shrunk so dramatically after Rome's fall. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the Church's influence extended into an entirely new and enormously consequential arena. Organizing and directing military campaigns aimed at reclaiming territory considered sacred to Christianity, launching one of the defining and most brutal chapters of the entire medieval period. In November 1095, Pope Urban II delivered a speech at the Council of Clermont in France that would trigger nearly 2 centuries of intermittent religious warfare between Western European Christians and Islamic powers, controlling the Holy Land, centered on the city of Jerusalem. Urban's call combined genuine religious motivation, reclaiming Christian holy sites and responding to appeals for help from the Byzantine emperor facing Islamic Seljuk Turkish military pressure, with a range of other incentives that historians have extensively documented. Promises of spiritual forgiveness for participants, opportunities for land and wealth for younger sons of nobility who wouldn't inherit family estates under primogeniture inheritance systems, and, for the Church itself, an opportunity to redirect Europe's chronic internal warfare between Christian nobles outward, toward a shared external cause. The response was massive and, in some cases, catastrophically disorganized. Before the main organized armies of what's now called the First Crusade even departed, an unauthorized, poorly equipped mass movement known as the People's Crusade led by a charismatic preacher named Peter the Hermit, set out toward the Holy Land and was largely destroyed by Seljuk forces in Anatolia after suffering from poor organization, inadequate supplies, and, disturbingly, engaging in violent anti-Semitic attacks against Jewish communities in the Rhineland along the way, a horrifying pattern of violence against European Jewish populations that would recur during multiple subsequent crusades. The main First Crusade armies, better organized and militarily led by experienced nobles, achieved what most contemporary observers considered nearly impossible, capturing Jerusalem in 1099 after a brutal siege, establishing a set of crusader states across the Levant that would survive in shrinking form for nearly 2 centuries. Contemporary accounts, including from crusader chroniclers themselves, describe extensive massacres of the city's Muslim and Jewish population following its capture, violence so severe that it remains, to this day, one of the most historically significant sources of tension in how the Crusades are remembered across the Christian and Islamic worlds respectively. Over the following 2 centuries, a total of roughly 8 to 9 major crusades, along with numerous smaller campaigns, were launched with varying degrees of success and, frequently, spectacular failure. The Second Crusade, launched in response to the fall of the Crusader state of Edessa, ended in serious defeat. The Third Crusade, launched after the brilliant Muslim military and political leader Saladin recaptured Jerusalem in 1187, pitted some of medieval Europe's most famous figures, including England's King Richard the Lionheart, against Saladin directly, ultimately ending in a negotiated settlement that left Jerusalem under Muslim control but guaranteed Christian pilgrim access to the city. Perhaps the most historically bizarre chapter came with the Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, which never reached the Holy Land at all. Diverted by financial disputes and Venetian commercial interests, this crusading army instead attacked and brutally sacked Constantinople itself in 1204, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, a fellow Christian state that the Crusades were nominally supposed to be defending. This catastrophic, almost unbelievable diversion devastated Byzantine power so severely that historians widely consider it a critical factor in the empire's long-term decline, weakening it fatally in the centuries before its eventual final fall to Ottoman forces in 1453. By the late 13th century, with the fall of the last major Crusader stronghold at Acre in 1291, the era of large-scale crusading campaigns to the Holy Land had effectively ended, though crusading rhetoric and smaller campaigns, including against other targets entirely, continued for centuries afterward. The Crusades' long-term legacy is genuinely complicated. They contributed to increased trade and cultural exchange between Europe and the wider Mediterranean and Islamic world, exposed medieval Europeans to advanced Islamic scholarship, science, and mathematics that would later feed into the Renaissance, and simultaneously left behind centuries of religious violence and mistrust, whose echoes remain relevant to how these regions relate to one another even today. While the Crusades unfolded abroad, Western Europe itself, particularly from roughly the 11th through 13th centuries, a period historians call the High Middle Ages, experienced substantial internal growth, stability, and institutional development. This was the Great Age of castle building, as improved agricultural productivity, population growth, and evolving military technology led to the construction of increasingly sophisticated fortifications across the continent, from early wooden motte-and-bailey structures to the massive stone concentric castles that still define popular imagination of the medieval world. These weren't simply defensive structures. They functioned as administrative centers, symbols of lordly power, and, in the case of royal castles, tools for projecting centralized authority across newly conquered or contested territory, as seen extensively in England following the Norman conquest. This period also saw the full development of chivalry, an evolving code of conduct for knights that combined military prowess with, at least in theory, ideals of honor, loyalty, protection of the weak, and courtly behavior toward women, heavily influenced by church teaching aimed at channeling aristocratic violence into more structured, socially acceptable forms. The reality of medieval warfare, it's worth being honest, frequently fell dramatically short of chivalric ideals, particularly regarding treatment of common people caught in the path of campaigning armies. But chivalry as a cultural and literary ideal profoundly shaped medieval aristocratic identity and gave rise to an enormous body of romantic literature, including the King Arthur legends that reached much of their most familiar form during exactly this period. Political developments during the High Middle Ages laid groundwork that would prove remarkably durable. In England, escalating conflict between King John and his rebellious barons, frustrated by excessive taxation and arbitrary royal power, led to the sealing of the Magna Carta in 1215, a document establishing, at least in principle, that even the king was subject to certain legal limits and couldn't rule with entirely unchecked authority. Magna Carta's immediate practical impact in 1215 was actually quite limited, and King John himself sought papal annulment of it almost immediately. But the document's underlying principle, that royal power has legal boundaries, would be repeatedly revived, reinterpreted, and cited by English and, later, American political thinkers for centuries afterward, eventually influencing foundational American legal and constitutional thinking. This period also produced one of medieval Europe's most consequential and lasting institutional innovations, the university. Building on earlier church-run cathedral schools, formal universities began emerging in the late 11th and 12th centuries, with the University of Bologna, focused heavily on law, generally considered among the very earliest, followed by the University of Paris, which became the preeminent center for theological and philosophical study, and Oxford in England, which developed from existing teaching traditions into a formally organized university by the late 12th century. These institutions developed standardized curricula, formal degree systems, and structured methods of debate and argumentation that would shape Western higher education for the next 900 years and counting. Gothic architecture, with its soaring pointed arches, ribbed vaulting, and dramatic stained glass windows designed to flood church interiors with colored light, also emerged and flourished during this period, producing cathedrals. Notre Dame in Paris, Chartres, Cologne, that remain among the most visited and architecturally studied structures in the world, built through generations of sustained community investment and increasingly sophisticated engineering knowledge. Economically, this was also a period of substantial recovery and growth. Towns expanded long-distance trade networks, particularly across the Mediterranean through Italian merchant cities like Venice and Genoa, and across northern Europe through what became known as the Hanseatic League, flourished, and a genuine merchant and artisan middle class began developing meaningful economic and, eventually, political influence in a way that hadn't existed at scale since Rome's collapse. Then, in the middle of the 14th century, all of that growth collided with the single deadliest catastrophe medieval Europe would ever face. In 1347, ships arriving at the Sicilian port of Messina carried something far more devastating than any cargo their crews intended, a bacterial pathogen, Yersinia pestis, that would go on to kill, according to most modern historical estimates, somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population within roughly 4 catastrophic years. History remembers it as the Black Death. The disease, most likely originating in Central Asia and carried westward along trade routes, including the same Mongol-controlled trade networks that had, ironically, helped connect and enrich medieval Eurasia in previous decades, spread through Europe with terrifying speed. Transmitted primarily by fleas living on black rats that traveled easily aboard merchant ships and along established trade routes that, by this point in the medieval period, connected nearly every major population center on the continent. Contemporary accounts of the plague's symptoms and its effects on medieval society are almost uniformly horrifying. Victims frequently developed painful swollen lymph nodes called buboes, followed by fever and, in a large percentage of cases, death within days of symptom onset. Entire households died together. Some villages were left with too few survivors to bury the dead properly. Medieval physicians, working with medical knowledge that had no framework for understanding bacterial infection or flea-borne transmission, proposed a wide range of explanations and remedies, from bad air called miasma to divine punishment for human sin, and treatments ranging from bloodletting to, in some deeply tragic and historically significant cases, violent persecution of Jewish communities who were falsely blamed for deliberately poisoning wells and causing the plague. Accusations that led to horrific massacres of Jewish populations across parts of Europe, particularly in the Holy Roman Empire, even as Jewish communities were dying from the plague at similar rates to their Christian neighbors. The demographic and economic aftermath of losing such a massive percentage of the population in such a short period fundamentally reshaped medieval European society in ways that took generations to fully play out. With so many agricultural laborers dead, Surviving peasants and serfs suddenly held far more negotiating leverage than they'd ever had before. Labor had become scarce and valuable in a way medieval feudal structures had never previously accounted for. Wages for surviving laborers rose substantially in many regions, and the rigid feudal obligations that had bound peasants to specific manners for generations began breaking down under this new economic pressure, contributing directly to major social unrest, including large-scale peasant uprisings like the 1381 Peasants' Revolt in England, when former feudal expectations collided violently with attempts by landowners and the government to enforce pre-plague wage and labor restrictions. The Black Death also had less immediately obvious but historically significant effects on medieval religious and intellectual life. Widespread death on this scale, striking the pious and impious alike with no apparent pattern that matched medieval religious explanations for suffering, contributed to a documented erosion of confidence in existing church authority and traditional religious explanations for catastrophe among some portions of the population. A shift in perspective that historians consider one of many long-term contributing factors, among several others, that eventually fed into the religious questioning and reform movements of the following centuries. Europe's population wouldn't fully recover to its pre-plague levels for well over 100 years, and the plague itself didn't simply disappear after its initial devastating outbreak. Recurring waves of bubonic plague continued striking European populations periodically for centuries afterward, though none matched the catastrophic scale of the initial 1347 to 1351 outbreak. Almost simultaneously with the plague's devastation, Western Europe's two most powerful kingdoms, England and France, were locked in what would become one of the longest sustained conflicts in medieval history. A series of connected wars, fought intermittently from 1337 to 1453, that later historians would name, with a certain grim accuracy, the 100 Years' War. The war's origins traced back to a genuinely complicated dynastic dispute over the French throne, following the death of the French king Charles IV in 1328 without a direct male heir. King Edward III of England, whose mother was a French princess, claimed a legitimate right to the French crown, a claim French nobility rejected in favor of a cousin from the Valois family line instead. Underlying this dynastic dispute were also serious ongoing tensions over English territorial holdings within France, particularly the wealthy region of Gascony, and competing economic interests in the lucrative wool trade connecting England to Flanders. Early phases of the war produced some of medieval history's most famous and militarily significant battles, and they demonstrated a dramatic shift in medieval warfare technology and tactics. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346 and again at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, English armies, though frequently outnumbered by French forces, achieved devastating victories through the sustained, disciplined use of the Welsh longbow, a weapon capable of penetrating much of the plate armor worn by heavily armored French knights and cavalry at ranges that made traditional cavalry charges catastrophically costly. These battles marked a significant, if gradual, shift in medieval military thinking, demonstrating that disciplined infantry using effective ranged weapons could decisively defeat traditionally dominant heavy cavalry forces under the right battlefield conditions. By the early 1420s, following continued English military success and the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, English claims to the French throne appeared close to complete success, with the English king recognized as heir to the French crown itself. French fortunes appeared genuinely desperate. And then, in an episode that remains one of the most historically remarkable individual stories of the entire medieval period, a teenage peasant girl from the French village of Domremy, claiming to have received divine visions instructing her to help the French crown prince reclaim his kingdom, arrived at the French royal court in 1429. Joan of Arc, despite having no formal military training and facing enormous initial skepticism, was granted a small force and played a directly documented role in lifting the devastating English siege of Orléans in 1429, a victory that dramatically reversed French military momentum and psychological confidence at a critical moment in the war. Joan's subsequent military career was brief. She was captured by Burgundian forces allied with England in 1430, sold to the English, subjected to a politically motivated ecclesiastical trial on charges including heresy, and burned at the stake in Rouen in 1431 at approximately 19 years old. 25 years later, a posthumous retrial, ordered by the French crown once the war had shifted decisively in France's favor, formally overturned her original conviction. And centuries later, in 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her as a saint. French military and political fortunes, having been galvanized by Joan's initial successes, continued improving over the following decades. Combined with improving French use of artillery and reformed, more professional French military organization, French forces gradually reclaimed English-held territory across France through the 1440s and early 1450s. The war's effective conclusion came in 1453 with the French victory at the Battle of Castellon, leaving England in control of only the port city of Calais on French soil, a dramatic reversal from the near-total English dominance of just 3 decades earlier. The Hundred Years' War's long-term consequences extended well beyond the battlefield. It significantly accelerated the development of French and English national identity, contributed directly to political and administrative centralization in both kingdoms as monarchs built more permanent standing armies and more sophisticated taxation systems to fund sustained warfare, and, through its demonstrated battlefield effectiveness, accelerated the broader medieval shift away from knightly cavalry and feudal levy armies toward professional, centrally organized military forces, one of several converging developments that were, by the mid-15th century, beginning to erode the feudal social and military structures that had defined medieval Europe for centuries. By the mid to late 15th century, medieval Europe was in ways contemporaries could only partially recognize at the time, transitioning into something new. In 1453, the same year the Hundred Years' War finally ended, Constantinople, the last remnant of the Roman Empire that had endured for nearly 1,000 years after Rome's fall in the West, was captured by Ottoman Turkish forces under Sultan Mehmed II, ending Byzantine political existence entirely and sending waves of Greek scholars fleeing westward into Italy, carrying with them classical Greek manuscripts and knowledge that would significantly fuel the already emerging Italian Renaissance. Around the same period, in the 1440s, a German craftsman named Johannes Gutenberg developed a functional printing press using movable metal type, adapted from existing technology but refined into something that would prove one of the most transformative inventions in human history. Books that had previously required months of painstaking hand copying by monks or professional scribes could now be produced far faster and over subsequent decades far more cheaply, dramatically expanding literacy and the spread of ideas across Europe in ways that would prove absolutely essential to the coming Renaissance and, within a century, the Protestant Reformation as well. And in 1492, within the same general historical window, Christopher Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic, funded by the Spanish crown, opened an entirely new chapter in European and world history whose consequences for Europe, for the Americas, and for the entire subsequent shape of the modern world would prove almost impossible to overstate. Historians don't agree on one single precise date when medieval ends and early modern begins, and honestly, that's the right way to think about it. Historical periods don't end on a single afternoon. But by the closing decades of the 15th century, the interlocking institutions that had defined medieval European life for 1,000 years, feudal land relationships increasingly eroded by plague-driven economic change, church authority increasingly challenged by expanding literacy and eventually direct theological reform, fragmented regional kingdoms increasingly consolidating into more centralized, administratively sophisticated nation-states, were all visibly, measurably giving way to something new. 1,000 years is an almost impossible span to compress into a single story, and what should stay with you isn't a list of dates. It's the pattern underneath them, a civilization that lost its unifying empire and spent the next 10 centuries rebuilding, piece by piece, entirely new systems of law, education, governance, and belief. Surviving plague that killed more than half its population in some regions, surviving centuries of internal and external warfare, and still managing to produce the university, the foundations of constitutional limits on royal power, and enough accumulated knowledge and institutional infrastructure to fuel the Renaissance that followed. Medieval Europe wasn't a 1,000-year pause between Rome and the modern world. It was the 1,000 years that actually built the bridge between them. If this gave you a real complete picture of an era most people only know in fragments, hit like, subscribe if you're not already, and let me know in the comments, out of everything covered here, which part of medieval history do you want a full deep dive episode on next?